The Old Testament reading is 1 Samuel chapter 17, beginning with the first verse. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Socoh. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. And the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had greaves of bronze upon his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. And the shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield-bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel,
"Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us."
When Saul and all Israel heard these words, the words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now David rose early in the morning and left the sheep with the keeper and took the provisions and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the encampment as the host was going forth to the battle line, shouting the war cry. And David ran to the ranks and went and greeted his brothers. As he talked with them, behold, the champion of the Philistines of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before. And David heard him, and David said to Saul,
"Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine."
And Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth." But David said to Saul,
"Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and smote him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he rose against me, I caught him by his beard and smote him and killed him. Your servant has killed both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine."
And Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Then Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. And David girded his sword over his armor, and he tried in vain to go, for he was not used to them. Then David said to Saul,
"I cannot go with these, for I am not used to them."
And David put them off. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's bag or wallet. His sling was in his hand, and he drew near the Philistine. And the Philistine came on and drew near to David with his shield-bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and comely in appearance. And the Philistine said to David,
"Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?"
And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David,
"Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field."
Then David said to the Philistine,
"You come to me with the sword and with the spear and with the javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head, and I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand."
When the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine. There was no sword in his hand. Then David stood over the Philistine, took his sword, and cut off his head and brought it to Jerusalem. This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Well, David and Goliath, familiar story. It's kind of David's George Washington moment, that heroism out of childhood. You know, George Washington, I cannot tell a lie, I did chop down the cherry tree. David goes out and he fells not a tree, but a giant. Cut down a giant. In times past, when I've preached on this, I've tried to recall what I've said. I've always been intrigued that children like this story so much. On the one hand, it makes sense because there's a child who's the hero. At the same time, it is a violent story that involves a decapitation. Oh my goodness. I thought about that shot with the slingshot. When I was a little boy, I tried this out in the backyard. My parents came out to stop me quickly. The shot with the slingshot. You know, was David a really good shot that he could make a stone go right into Goliath's forehead? Or was God guiding that shot somehow? Or maybe even it was both. Maybe sometimes we're really good at something and God also guides it. We could talk about the felling of giants, and especially the giant of death itself. Maybe that's what this story symbolizes. Is because of the gospel, death has been felled and has no more power over us. Maybe it's a story about the fact that it's good that the big don't always win. Aren't you glad about that? That the big and the strong are not always the victors? I tried to think about this passage this week, and what I did thinking about stones is I was up at conference at Lake Junaluska. I walked by the lake and I found a small stone and I put it in my pocket. As I walked around the rest of the week, I thought about David and his stone. And there are three things that especially have come to interest me. One has to do with technology. One has to do with vulnerability. And the third has to do with an exaggeration. First, technology. Very interesting. David is fighting Goliath. The Israelites are fighting the Philistines. The Philistines had an enormous technological advantage. We're right on the cusp of the Bronze Age becoming the Iron Age. The Philistines had the distinction of being the first people who figured out how to use iron in warfare, right? So they were the first to have shields and weapons that were made of iron instead of bronze. And you can imagine the advantage that this gave them. The Israelites would go into war, and they had their swords that were made of wood and bronze, and their shields that were made of wood and bronze, and they had always served them very well. But suddenly you're up against a warrior who has iron. You've never seen iron before. So you come with your sword and you swing at this Philistine, but when you hit his shield that is made of iron, your sword just splinters into 1,000 pieces. And then he takes his iron sword and swings it your way, and you hold up your shield that has worked for years, and your shield just falls into so many pieces. Huge technological advantage in addition to Goliath being big. Now, this is a little bit of a reach. I've never done that in a sermon before. Kind of reached for something. But here it goes. God is not undone by having a technological advance out there. God is not undone by technological advances. Last Sunday morning, maybe you saw this in the newspaper, there's an article about churches and religion and technology and social media. And it's an interesting article because it featured, me. It had a photo of me. It talked about our church. It talked about me, James Howell, the social media mogul. It was funny by sundown because, to show you how not advanced I really am, it was Father's Day, and my children pooled their money, and I suspect that was augmented by some of their mother's money, and I was given an iPad. Here's how it went. I figured out how to get the iPad out of the box, but then I was unable to turn the iPad on. It has a little button on the top. I missed that somehow. This is funny. James, the technological titan, can't turn on an iPad. How should we say it? We're not against technology. We embrace technology. It's just inevitable. It's all around us. But here's something that I believe is true. Technology will never produce courage. And technology will never produce availability for God. And I would even suggest that technology works against these things. That the more technology we have, the less likely we are to be courageous. And I know this is true. The more technology we have, the less available we are to God, because we're available to everybody else at all times. Availability. Courage. That's what David had. David had courage, and he had availability to God. I thought about this. I had the stone in my pocket the other day. I reached in to my pocket compulsively, as I always do, to check my smartphone to see if I had an email or a text or a Facebook message or a Twitter message that needed replying. I am legendary for responding so rapidly. Some of you applaud me for this, so I reached in there and my hand hit the stone first. And I thought about David and the availability and the technological inferiority they had. You know what I did? This is shocking. I left the phone in my pocket. And you know what? The world did not come to an end. I was surprised by this, but it did not. How should we say it? David is one small guy. He's got some courage and he's got some availability before God. We could think of Goliath as sort of the troubles of the world. When we look at the problems of the world, they're so big. They're like Goliath. They're like the Philistines with this massive advantage, and we don't know what to do, and so we do what the Israelite soldiers did. Goliath hollers out his taunt, and what do the Israelite soldiers do? They kind of stare at the tops of their sandals. They clear their throats. Nobody even looks up. That's what we do. We think of the problems of the world, and it's just overwhelming, so we watch TV. We go out to eat, we kill time, we shop. I don't know what we do. But there are problems in the world, and God wants another kind of David, someone with some courage, or someone with some availability. Right now, we have a mission team in Brazil, and they are having the privilege of meeting a modern-day David. There is a missionary that they are getting to know in Rio whose name is Marion Way. Marion is amazing. He grew up in Charleston, South Carolina. And in the 50s, he heard about missionaries and thought, I want to be one. So he studied Portuguese, and he went to Angola as a missionary. But they were having a civil war in Angola, so they threw him in jail, beat him within an inch of his life. When he finally got out and back to America, he didn't do what you and I would do, which is like, forget the missionary gig. No, he said, where else do they speak Portuguese? Somebody said Brazil, and he went there 50 years ago. And he stayed for 50 years. He's a little skinny, strong. If I wrestled him, I could take him so easy. I just could beat him in 5 seconds because I'm strong. And he's just a frail little 80-year-old. But he's amazing. As he looked at the problems of the world, he didn't have a smartphone. He's not on Facebook. But he's gone into the poorest favelas in Rio, and he's loved children for 50 years. He's had some courage. He's made himself available to God. I would do this little project that I'm working on. I thought of it the other day. I was driving. I was almost home, and I saw a lemonade stand. And the people at the lemonade stand, they identified me, so I had to stop. There's no choice. I pulled over, lemonade. I didn't really want any. I said, okay. So I asked the little girl, I said, what's the money for? Sometimes they don't know. She said, it's for the Harvest Center. I thought, I love the Harvest Center. That's one of our great ministry partners. I said, okay, I'll take some lemonade. And I reached in my wallet, and I'm looking for a $1 bill. And the smallest I have is a 20. So I just give her the 20. She looks at me like I am the coolest lemonade buyer ever. And I look at her like she's the coolest lemonade salesperson ever. And I'm thinking about the Harvest Center, which is a cool ministry. It was a win-win-win, wasn't it? Well, I've got another little opportunity for you. We have a little mini mission campaign. We haven't even announced it yet. This is the announcement. We had some money that came to be available when we researched what to do with it. We found 3 projects that are just outstanding. One is with Charlotte Family Housing, one's with the Urban Ministry Center, the other is with the Battered Women's Shelter. And to complete all projects, we need a little more money than we have. I felt that stone in my pocket the other day when I was thinking about this. What choice did I have but to have a little courage and a little availability, and I wrote a check. Maybe you'll want to do the same thing. Second thing, vulnerability. This is very interesting. Goliath is not only huge, but he also has all this armor. I mean, he's totally covered. He's got a helmet, and he's got a shield, and he's got metal on his arms and his legs. Somebody calculated that his armor weighs 100 pounds. And he is totally covered up, even though he's already huge. What is that about? He has one vulnerable spot, the middle of his forehead, and that's what David Stone manages to find. He seemed to be invincible, but he was not. He had a vulnerable spot. And the question that raises in my mind for us is, what is your vulnerable spot? And if I ask you that, you might say, wrong question, dude. The question is, what are my vulnerable spots? We've got them, don't we? Little wounds, little fears, little anxieties. Maybe you've got the best medical care that money can buy, but you're still mortal, aren't you? Or you got a lot of money, you can buy things and accumulate a lot, but you still got a hollow place inside. Maybe you know how to go to lots of parties and have lots of fun, and at the end of the day, it still just doesn't quite deliver. You've got weaknesses, you got fears, you got darkness dancing around in your head. What are your vulnerabilities? What's fascinating about this is that David chooses to be vulnerable. Saul gives him armor, but David says, no, I'll just be vulnerable. I mean, Goliath's big and he's got all that armor, but I'm going to go out and be vulnerable. It's important for us to know our vulnerabilities because that's where God will meet us. It's important for us to own our weaknesses because that's God's opening. It's important for us to know where we just don't stand a chance and might get hurt and might not make it, because those are the places where God's grace can work some kind of miracle for us. I thought about where's Jesus' vulnerable spot? The answer would be his whole self. When Jesus took on the Romans, he didn't wear a helmet, didn't put on armor, didn't carry out a shield, didn't have a sword. He went out just as a poor man. And the Romans had their way with him, and he did that because he loves you and me. He became totally vulnerable to show God's love for us. I was thinking about this the other day. I had that stone in my pocket, and I was having just a bout of anxiety. And what do you do when you're anxious? You say, don't be anxious. That doesn't help at all. That makes you more anxious because you can't stop being anxious. What I did is I felt that stone in my pocket. And I thought about David and his vulnerability, but what God did with him. I thought about those passages in the Bible, that one of the Psalms that says, "O Lord, lift me up to a rock that is higher than I." Or those other Psalms that say, "O Lord, you are my rock and my Redeemer." That helps me a little. Here's the third thing, the exaggeration. You heard it read, how tall is Goliath? 6 cubits and a span. That comes out to 9 feet 9 inches tall. That is an absurdly tall person. That is freakishly tall. That is circus tent tall. 9 feet 9 inches. Have you ever seen anybody anywhere near that size? Well, lo and behold, they discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 1950s, the oldest copies of the Bible by 1,000 years. They'd never seen them before. They opened 1 Samuel. They came to the story, and it doesn't say that Goliath is 6 cubits in a span. It says that he's only 4 cubits in a span. Oh, my goodness. Well, that comes out to 6 feet 9 inches tall. That's still a ridiculously big person, especially in the ancient world where the average male was 4'11" or 5'1", 6 feet 9 inches tall. Why am I telling you this? Over time, when they copied the Bible, you know what they did? They exaggerated. He was 6'9", but they thought the miracle was so great, like, let's make him even taller. Let's make him 6 cubits in a span. It's kind of like the old fishing story, right? How big was that fish? Well, you just make it bigger, right? Exaggerate. I wanted to defend exaggeration to you. I'm finishing a book. It's about Do It the Publisher. And I've had some people reading chapters for me to help me out. And one chapter is on my grandparents. I sent it to somebody who emailed me back and said, when you talk about how great your grandparents are, I think you're exaggerating. I said, so? All right, what's wrong with that? You have great grandparents, why not exaggerate? What's gained by digging back and finding some flaws and some faults? Exaggerate. This is what lovers do, don't they? When a lover meets the beloved, he doesn't walk out and say, well, she was, I don't know, the 13th cutest girl in the room. No, the lover says, oh, she was stunning. She was marvelous. They can't find the words. They exaggerate. That's what lovers do. I've been trying to think about God, and maybe God doesn't mind if we exaggerate a little. Although if it's God, maybe you can't even exaggerate. Because after all, it's God. So how could you exaggerate? I'd rather err on the side of exaggerating about the greatness of God than to underestimate the greatness of God. How great is God? You should be like a lover, just tongue-tied, go on all day. I thought about this the other day. Again, I had this little stone in my pocket. I was sitting in a meeting that was a little bit dull, and I don't know what you do in a dull meeting. My mind starts wandering, and I don't know what I think about. I think dumb stuff. I think about who's boring up there. Hope you're not having that thought at this moment. I don't know what I think about. It's not real constructive thinking, and it's just so dumb. But what I did, I was bored, and I started to think those thoughts, but then I had that stone in my pocket. And I thought about exaggerating about the greatness of God. So instead of thinking whatever I usually would think, I started thinking about how great God is. And I got in this reverie. God made the world. He's wise. And he knows everything, loves me more than I love myself, sent Jesus, who was totally vulnerable, and instead of killing people, he let himself be wounded. His love for me, for all of us, is so great. And he loves everybody, the people that get on my nerves, and the people that nobody else cares about, and the people that are hungry, and the people who go to the harvest. And this was like a way better use of my brain power, right? Thinking about the greatness of God than thinking, well, gee, I'm bored. I wish this wouldn't be so boring. That was pretty good. I thought about this. After all, why did David go out and fight Goliath? It's not that that was an enemy that needed defeating. Sometimes it's just an enemy that just need to be defeated. But in this case, what got David, he heard Goliath's taunts. He didn't go out there until Goliath said, your God is nothing. And that's when David couldn't take it anymore. He went out not to defeat the giant. He went out to defend God's honor. He went out to demonstrate as best he was able that God really is great. That's why he went out vulnerable. That's why he went out in the name of the Lord instead of with a javelin or a spear. He decided he was going to show that God was great. Maybe that's actually a good life mission for each one of us. What's your life about? Maybe you could say, my life is going to be about, I'm going to try to show in my life that God is great. Maybe that's a good mission for a church. What's our mission? We're going to meet the budget, going to keep the lights on, pay the staff. It's good to pay the staff. We do these things. Maybe the mission of the church, though, should be we're here to show how great God is. That'd be cool to do that. So I'm done with the sermon, but let me make a little recommendation. Early this week, I found this little stone, and I've been carrying around in my pocket, and that's really helped me a lot. So maybe you today find a little stone someplace and carry it around with you. Think about David. Think about God. Think about who God calls us to be. Think about how great God is. Maybe that'll help you a little bit this week. Thanks be to God.